Commander Brackhon had seen plenty of weird things during his 30 cycles commanding the research vessel Stellar Wanderer. He'd witnessed gas clouds that sang lullabies, planets that grew upside down, and once, memorably, a space station populated entirely by sentient furniture with anger management issues. But this was testing even his considerable tolerance for the universe's more creative moments. The human sat cross-legged on the deck of Cargo Bay 3, surrounded by 6 small, crystalline-furred creatures that looked like someone had crossed a kitten with a disco ball and given the result anxiety issues. The Cubs, that's what the science team had dubbed them after their rescue from the dying world of Nexus 9, were pressed against the human's legs, purring in harmonious little chimes that would have been adorable if they weren't driving Brackhon's pack absolutely insane. "Jamie," Brackhon said, his voice carrying the particular tone of authority that had kept his crew in line through 3 wars and countless first contact scenarios. "Step away from the Cubs." The human, Jamie North, according to the identification chip they'd pulled from his battered smuggler's vest, looked up with those peculiar round eyes that humans insisted on having. "They haven't eaten in 18 hours, Commander. They're scared." "They are not scared," Brackhon replied, though even as he said it, he wasn't entirely convinced. The Cubs did look, well, if he was being honest, they looked like they were about to cry. Which was ridiculous, because preliminary scans indicated they were apex predators from a Class M world. Apex predators didn't cry. They certainly didn't cling to smugglers like lost children. "With respect, Commander," Jamie said, and somehow managed to make respect sound like the most sarcastic word in any language. "When's the last time you tried to feed a traumatized animal?" Brackhon's jaw tightened. The human had a point, a frustrating, inconvenient point that made Brackhon want to pace. The Cubs had been aboard the Wanderer for 3 days now, rescued from the smoldering remains of their homeworld just hours before the planet's core gave up and turned the whole place into an expensive light show. In those 3 days, the Cubs had refused every meal offered by the Kethmaran crew. Every single one. They'd tried everything. Fresh protein cubes, synthesized Nexus 9 vegetation, even live food that had cost more than Brackhon's monthly salary. The Cubs would approach the offerings, sniff delicately, then retreat to the corner of their containment area and make the most heartbreaking sounds the translator could only render as universal sadness in a minor key. But the moment Jamie North entered their space, the moment that scruffy, scarred human with his impossible hair and his irritating habit of humming off-key melodies sat down among them, they ate. Not just ate. They practically inhaled whatever he offered, be it standard, rations, or the fancy cuisine meant for visiting dignitaries. They ate with enthusiasm, with trust, with the kind of desperate gratitude that made even hardened space veterans uncomfortable. "Science Officer Moltara," Brackhon called, without taking his eyes off the bizarre tableau. "Report." Moltara approached with the careful, measured steps of someone who had learned not to make sudden movements around confused apex predators. Her datapad hummed softly as she consulted the latest readings. Physiologically, the Cubs appear to be in excellent health, Commander. No signs of malnutrition, disease, or injury. Their stress hormones spike whenever they're separated from the human, but normalize immediately upon his return. "Define spike," Brackhon said. "Levels consistent with imminent cardiac failure," Moltara replied, with the cheerful directness that made her such an effective scientist and such a terrifying dinner companion. "Ah." Brackhon watched as Jamie offered a cub something that looked suspiciously like a standard protein bar. The cub accepted it with tiny, grateful chirps, and settled down to eat with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for five-star meals. And our theories? Currently at 632, sir. None of them particularly convincing. Jamie looked up from his impromptu feeding session. Maybe try the simplest explanation? Which would be? Brackon asked, though he suspected he wasn't going to like the answer. They trust me, Jamie said with a shrug that somehow conveyed volumes about human psychology and the universe's apparent sense of humor. And they don't trust you. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that makes seasoned military officers consider early retirement. Finally, Moltara cleared her throat. The human may have a point, Commander. Initial behavioral analysis suggests the cubs are exhibiting classic signs of traumatic bonding. Their homeworld was destroyed by military action. We are clearly military personnel. The human is not. The human is a smuggler, Brackon pointed out. A smuggler who specializes in wildlife rehabilitation, Jamie corrected. Specialized. Past tense. These days I mostly move medical supplies to colony worlds that can't afford corporate shipping rates. How noble of you. I never claimed nobility, Commander. Just practicality. Sick colonists can't pay smugglers. It's bad for business. One of the cubs, the smallest one with fur that shifted between silver and gold in the ship's lights, finished its meal and padded over to Jamie's shoulder. It settled there with a contented sigh that sounded almost heartbreakingly human, then fixed Brackon with eyes that seemed far too intelligent for something that should, by all rights, be operating on pure instinct. They're smart, Jamie said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. Smarter than we're giving them credit for. Look at their behavior patterns. They're not just eating when I feed them. They're learning, watching, processing. Brackon frowned. Processing what? Everything, Jamie replied. Body language, vocal tones, micro-expressions. They're reading us constantly, cataloging threat levels, emotional states, intentions, and right now, they've decided I'm safe and you're not. I have no intention of harming them. I know that. You know that. But they don't know that. All they know is that beings with military bearing destroyed their world. And now more beings with military bearing want to control their food supply. Jamie scratched the small cub behind what might generously be called ears. From their perspective, I'm the only one here who doesn't remind them of the ones who killed their families. The words hit harder than Brackon expected. He looked at the cubs, really looked at them, and for the first time noticed details he'd missed. The way they positioned themselves with clear sight lines to all exits, the way their heads tracked movement with predatory precision, the way they never fully relaxed, even while eating. These weren't helpless babies. These were survivors. Sir, Moltara said softly, there's something else. The cubs have been communicating. Communicating how? With each other. Subsonic frequencies mostly, but also through chemical markers and what appears to be a complex system of microgestures. They're not just bonding with the human. They're sharing information about him, about us, about the ship. Brackon felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders, like a lead cloak. Every instinct he'd developed over decades of service was telling him this situation was more complicated than a simple case of interspecies attachment. The cubs weren't just traumatized refugees. They were intelligent, observant, and potentially dangerous beings who had survived the destruction of their entire world. And they had chosen to trust a human smuggler over a decorated Kethmaran military officer. How long can we sustain this arrangement? He asked. Indefinitely, from a resource standpoint, Moltara replied. The cubs don't eat much, and they seem content with standard rations when the human provides them. From a practical standpoint, she gestured at Jamie, who was now surrounded by all 6 cubs in what could only be described as a protective formation. We may not have a choice, sir. They've essentially claimed him. Claimed him? Pack behavior, Commander. They've decided he belongs to them, and they belong to him. Attempting to separate them at this point could trigger a defensive response. Brakhon studied the scene before him. 6 potentially lethal predators arranged around a scruffy human, like furry, crystalline bodyguards. The human himself seemed completely at ease, as if he'd spent his entire life being adopted by alien apex predators with trust issues. "Mr. North?" Brakhon said finally. "Yes, Commander?" "What exactly did you do before you became a smuggler?" Jamie's smile was wry and tired and somehow familiar, though Brakhon couldn't place why. "I ran a wildlife rehabilitation center on New Montana, specialized in apex predators with behavioral issues. Turns out, when your funding gets cut and your world gets glassed by corporate raiders, those skills translate pretty well to the smuggling business. And now? Now I'm apparently a surrogate parent to 6 alien children with attachment disorders and an impressive capacity for property damage." Jamie's expression grew serious. "They're not pets, Commander. They're not weapons. They're kids who watched their world die and decided the only way to survive was to find someone they could trust completely." The small cub on Jamie's shoulder made a soft sound that the translator rendered as contentment mixed with vigilance. Its eyes never left Brakhon's face. "The question is," Jamie continued, "what are we going to do about it?" Brakhon looked at his science officer, who shrugged in a way that suggested the universe had officially moved beyond the realm of standard procedures. He looked at the cubs, who watched him with the patience of beings who had learned to evaluate threats carefully before acting. Finally, he looked at Jamie North, smuggler, wildlife rehabilitator, and apparently the only being in the galaxy who could convince a pack of traumatized apex predators to eat their vegetables. "We're going to figure it out," he said finally, "because something tells me this is just the beginning." Outside the cargo bay's viewport, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small drama playing out aboard the stellar wanderer. But somewhere in the vast darkness between worlds, sensors were tracking their course, and beings with very different intentions were making plans of their own. The cubs sensed it first, of course. Their crystal fur began to shimmer with colors that had no names in any language, and their harmonious purring took on an edge that made the hair on the back of Jamie's neck stand up. Trouble was coming. And for the first time since their rescue, the cubs looked less like refugees and more like what they truly were: the last survivors of a world that had died fighting. The next morning, if morning had any meaning aboard a ship hurtling through the void at speeds that made physics professors weep, Brakhon decided to take matters into his own claws. He'd spent the night cycle reviewing every protocol, regulation, and manual in the Kethmoran military database, searching for some precedent, some procedure that might explain how to handle 6 apex predators who had apparently decided that military authority was optional. He found nothing, not even a footnote. "Tactical Officer Hemricks," he called as he entered the cargo bay. "Initiate Protocol Theta 9. Hemricks, a veteran of the Outer Rim conflicts with scars to prove it, nodded grimly. "Aye, sir. Non-confrontational resource distribution with graduated authority. Establishment." Jamie, who was sitting cross-legged in his usual spot, while the cubs arranged themselves around him like fuzzy, crystalline sentries, looked up with an expression that suggested He'd heard similar phrases right before things went spectacularly wrong. "That sounds ominous." "It's perfectly reasonable," Brackhorn replied. "We're simply going to demonstrate that the ship's command structure can provide for the Cub's needs without requiring your direct intervention." "Ah!" Jamie's tone was carefully neutral. "And how exactly are you planning to do that?" "Watch and learn, Mr. North." What followed could generously be described as educational. If your definition of education included watching trained military personnel systematically fail to convince 6 small aliens to accept food from anyone other than a scruffy human with questionable life choices. First, Hemricks tried the direct approach, marching up to the Cubs with a bowl of their favorite synthesized protein, and announcing nutritional provisions distributed by command authority. The Cubs looked at him, then at each other, then made a sound that the translator helpfully rendered as polite confusion mixed with second-hand embarrassment. Next came the environmental approach. Multara had theorized that perhaps the Cubs were responding to olfactory cues, so they attempted to mask the Kethmaran scent markers with neutralizing agents. This resulted in Cargo Bay 3 smelling like a chemical spill in a flower shop, and the Cubs retreating to the furthest corner where they huddled together, making noises that sounded suspiciously like alien laughter. "Maybe they're responding to vocal patterns," suggested Junior Science Officer Nokan, who was either very brave or very stupid. He proceeded to attempt feeding the Cubs while mimicking Jamie's voice patterns through the ship's vocal modulator. The result was a sound that could only be described as human speech, filtered through a dying accordion. And the Cub's response was to look at Jamie as if to say, "Are you going to let him keep doing that to your language?" "Your turn," Brackhorn said to Multara, who had been taking notes with the focused intensity of someone watching a particularly fascinating disaster unfold. Multara approached with scientific precision, carrying a carefully calibrated meal and speaking in measured tones about nutritional requirements and optimal feeding schedules. The Cubs listened politely, then promptly fell asleep. All of them, simultaneously, while maintaining perfect defensive positioning. "They're mocking us," Hemricks muttered. "They're making a point," Jamie corrected. "You're all trying to solve the wrong problem." "Enlighten us," Brackhorn said through gritted teeth. Jamie stood slowly, careful not to disturb the Cubs, and walked to the center of the bay. "You keep treating this like a logistics problem. Food distribution, resource allocation, command structure. But that's not what this is about." "Then what is it about?" "Trust," Jamie said simply. "They don't trust you because you haven't given them a reason to. You've been trying to establish authority over them instead of building a relationship with them." "We are not running a therapy session, Mr. North. This is a military vessel." "And they are not military personnel," Jamie shot back. "They're traumatized children who watched their entire species get wiped out. They're not going to respond to orders and protocols. They're going to respond to genuine care and consistent behavior." One of the Cubs, the medium-sized one with fur that shifted between copper and bronze, opened one eye and fixed it on Brackhorn with an expression that seemed to say, "Finally, someone gets it." "So, what do you suggest?" Multara asked, her scientific curiosity overriding military hierarchy. Jamie was quiet for a moment, studying the Cubs with the kind of focused attention that comes from years of reading animal behavior. "They're not just bonding with me," he said finally. "They're studying me, learning my patterns, my responses, my emotional states. They're building a psychological profile." "To what end?" "Survival." Jamie's voice was grim. "Think about it. Their world was destroyed by what, exactly? Brakhon consulted his datapad. Preliminary reports suggest orbital bombardment by an unknown faction. Complete atmospheric ignition within 6 hours of initial contact. Unknown faction with military capabilities and the willingness to commit genocide, Jamie translated. From the Cubs' perspective, militarized beings are an existential threat. So they're doing what any intelligent species would do. They're learning to read potential threats and allies with perfect accuracy. You're saying they can sense our intentions? I'm saying they're getting very good at it. Watch. Jamie moved to where Hemrick stood holding the rejected protein bowl. Hand me that. Hemricks passed over the bowl with obvious reluctance. Jamie took it, approached the Cubs, and offered it exactly as Hemricks had done moments before. The Cubs immediately perked up and began eating with obvious enthusiasm. Same food, same delivery method, Moltara observed. Different result. Same everything except the emotional context, Jamie corrected. Hemricks was offering food as part of a military exercise. I'm offering food because I want them to eat. That's ridiculous, Brakhon said, but even as he spoke, he wasn't entirely convinced. The Cubs had finished their meal and were now grooming each other with obvious contentment, behavior they'd never exhibited after the crew's feeding attempts. Is it? Jamie asked. You've all been approaching them like they're sophisticated animals. But what if they're not animals at all? What if they're people? The silence that followed was profound enough to have its own gravitational field. Finally, Moltara spoke. The preliminary scans indicated pre-sentient intelligence levels. Preliminary? Scans can be wrong, Jamie replied, especially when you're dealing with a species under extreme trauma. They might be suppressing their true capabilities as a survival mechanism. Or, Hemrick said slowly, they might be evaluating us. As if summoned by the conversation, the largest of the Cubs, the one with fur that shifted through the entire spectrum like a living aurora, rose and padded over to Brakhon. It sat precisely 1 meter away, close enough to demonstrate intent, far enough to maintain escape routes, and fixed him with eyes that seemed far too old for its apparent age. Then it spoke. Not in the harmonic chimes they'd grown accustomed to, but in perfectly clear, slightly accented Kethmaran. Commander Brakhon, we need to talk. The bowl Moltara had been holding clattered to the deck. Hemricks made a sound that might have been a curse in 3 different languages. Brakhon felt his world tilt sideways and reorganize itself around a single, inescapable fact. They had not rescued 6 traumatized animals from a dying world. They had rescued 6 traumatized people who had been pretending to be animals for 3 days while studying their potential captors with the focused intensity of professional intelligence operatives. How long? Brakhon managed. Since the moment your people found us, the Cub replied. We needed to determine your intentions before revealing our true nature. The beings who destroyed our world also began with rescue operations. And your conclusion? The Cub tilted its head in a gesture that was unmistakably thoughtful. You are not them, but you are still military, still bound by protocols and hierarchies that prioritize objectives over individuals. This makes you complicated. Jamie stepped forward. And me? For the first time since it had spoken, the Cub's expression shifted to something that might have been affection. You are simple. You see beings in distress and respond with care. You do not calculate political advantage or strategic benefit. You simply help. So the feeding ritual? A test, another Cub said, this one slightly smaller with fur that shifted between deep blue and violet. We needed to identify who among your crew could be trusted with our lives. The answer was, only the human. Brakhon felt a mix of admiration and professional embarrassment that would have been impressive if it weren't so deeply uncomfortable. You've been running a counterintelligence operation on my ship for 3 days. We prefer to think of it as extended due diligence, the largest cub replied with what might have been humor, though we understand your perspective may differ. What's your actual age range? Multara asked, her scientific curiosity overriding her shock. In your terms, approximately equivalent to your young adults? We are. The cub paused, consulting with the others in rapid harmonic bursts. The word translates poorly. Academic warriors, scholars trained in survival, and assessment. Spies, Hemrick said flatly. Students, Jamie corrected. Survivors. People trying to figure out if the universe still has any safe places left. The largest cub looked directly at Brakhon. Commander, we offer you a bargain. We will share what we know of the beings who destroyed our world. Intelligence that your military would find valuable. In exchange, we ask for sanctuary until we can determine our next course of action. And if I refuse? The cub's expression didn't change, but somehow the temperature in the cargo bay seemed to drop a few degrees. Then we will wait for a better opportunity to escape and find sanctuary elsewhere. We survived the destruction of our world, Commander. We can survive anything else the universe chooses to offer. Brakhon looked at his crew, then at Jamie, then at 6 beings who had just upended every assumption he'd made about intelligence, survival, and the nature of trust itself. Outside, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the small drama playing out in Cargo Bay 3. But something had changed. The cubs were no longer mysterious refugees to be studied and contained. They were potential allies, possible enemies, and definitely the most competent intelligence operatives he'd encountered in his entire career. And they had chosen to trust a human smuggler over his entire crew. Mr. North, he said finally. Yes, Commander? It appears you're going to be busier than expected. The emergency klaxons started wailing 3 hours after the cubs revealed their true nature, which was either terrible timing or absolutely perfect timing, depending on your perspective. Brakhon had been in the middle of what he was generously calling a diplomatic negotiation, and what everyone else recognized as a career military officer trying not to have an existential crisis in front of teenage alien super spies, when the ship's proximity alarms decided to join the conversation. Commander, to the bridge, came the urgent voice of Navigation Officer Kelwin. We have contacts, multiple contacts, and they're not running standard identification protocols. Define multiple, Brakhon called as he strode toward the door, muscle memory and training taking over, despite the fact that his worldview had been turned inside out and shaken vigorously. 8 vessels, sir. Patrol class, heavily armed, and broadcasting on frequencies registered to the Harkon Syndicate. Brakhon stopped walking. Behind him, he heard Jamie mutter a string of words that the translator diplomatically refused to process. The cubs, meanwhile, had gone completely still in that particular way that predators do when they sense approaching danger. The Harkon Syndicate, said the largest cub, who had introduced himself as something that translated roughly to keen edge of thoughtful analysis, but preferred to be called Edge, destroyed our world. Well, Brakhon said, with the kind of calm that comes from years of experience with impossible situations, that's inconvenient. The next few minutes were a masterclass in controlled chaos. The bridge erupted into activity as the crew prepared for potential combat, while in Cargo Bay 3, 6 beings who had spent 3 days pretending to be helpless refugees suddenly transformed into something that made Brackhon's tactical officers look like enthusiastic amateurs. "Jamie," Edge said, his harmonic voice taking on undertones that made the air itself seem sharper. "We need you to understand something very important." "I'm listening," Jamie replied, though his attention was clearly divided between the cubs and the flashing emergency lights that painted everything in shades of amber urgency. "When we said we were academic warriors, we may have simplified our actual capabilities." "Simplified how?" The smallest cub, who went by Swift Current Through Stone, or Current for short, padded over to the cargo bay's wall panel and placed a small furred paw against the access port. The panel lit up with symbols that definitely weren't part of Kethmaran's standard interface design. "We may have been making some unauthorized modifications to your ship's systems," Current admitted, "for defensive purposes." "What kind of modifications?" Brackhon demanded. "The useful kind," said a third cub, whose name translated to something like harmony beneath chaos, but who answered to harmony. She gestured, and suddenly the cargo bay's view screen activated, displaying a tactical overview that was far more detailed than anything the Stellar Wanderer's standard sensors should have been able to produce. 8 ships hung in space like mechanical predators, their weapons charged and targeting systems active. But more importantly, and more disturbingly, the display showed their exact shield configurations, weapon loadouts, crew complements, and what appeared to be detailed psychological profiles of their commanding officers. "How?" Moltara breathed. "We've been observing since our rescue," explained another cub, whose name was mercifully shortened to Whisper. "Your ship's sensor array is quite sophisticated. With minor adjustments, it becomes remarkably effective at gathering intelligence." "Minor adjustments?" Brackhon's voice climbed toward frequencies that only dogs and very concerned military commanders could hear. "We may have accidentally turned your research vessel into the most advanced spy ship in this sector," Edge admitted. "The good news is that we now know exactly what we're facing." The bad news, as it turned out, was considerably more complex. "The Harkon Syndicate doesn't just want us back," Current explained, manipulating the display with casual expertise that made the ship's actual navigation officer look like he was operating technology with mittens on. "They want the human, too." "Me?" Jamie looked genuinely surprised. "Why would they want me?" "Because," Harmony said, with the tone of someone delivering very unwelcome news. "You've done something that no one else in recorded galactic history has accomplished. Which is, you've gained the complete trust of a Nexari pod." The silence that followed had weight and texture, like something you could reach out and touch. Finally, Brackhon found his voice. "Nexari. Our actual species designation," Edge explained. We're the Nexari. We served as diplomatic assessors and cultural interpreters for the Galactic Council before the Harkon Syndicate decided our homeworld would make an excellent example of their military capabilities. "And the significance of Jamie gaining your trust?" "Commander," Whisper said gently, "the Nexari were created, evolved, adapted, choose your preferred term, to be living lie detectors. We can read emotional truth across species barriers with perfect accuracy. We can sense deception, malice, fear, love, hatred, and every shade of intention in between. In our entire recorded history," Current added, "spanning roughly 12,000 of your standard cycles, no being has ever successfully deceived a Nexari pod. We have been used to negotiate treaties, prevent wars, identify criminals, and establish trust between species that had no other common ground. Jamie was very quiet for a long moment. And I somehow… What? Passed some kind of test? You didn't pass a test, Edge said. You did something infinitely more remarkable. You were genuinely, completely, authentically yourself in our presence. No deception, no hidden agendas, no ulterior motives. Just honest care for beings in distress. That's not remarkable, Jamie protested. That's basic decency. Exactly, Harmony replied. And in 12,000 cycles of galactic civilization, you are the first being we have encountered who demonstrated it consistently, without reservation, and without expecting anything in return. The implications hit Brakhon like a freight shuttle traveling at orbital velocity. If the Cubs, the Nexari, were living truth detectors, and if they had decided Jamie was the only trustworthy being they'd encountered, then either the entire galaxy was populated by liars and manipulators, or humans possessed some unique quality that made them fundamentally different from every other known species. Neither possibility was particularly comforting. The Harkon Syndicate knows what we are, Edge continued. They destroyed our world not just to eliminate us, but to capture the survivors. A Nexari pod under their control would give them an insurmountable advantage in every negotiation, every conflict, every political maneuvering in known space. And now they know that a human has gained our trust, Current added, which means they know something about human psychology that could be problematic for the rest of the galaxy if it fell into the wrong hands. So this isn't just about rescuing refugees, Moltara said. This is about preventing the Syndicate from acquiring both living lie detectors and the key to understanding human behavioral patterns. Precisely, Edge confirmed, though we prefer to think of it as preventing the collapse of galactic civilization as we know it. We find that framing helps with perspective. The tactical display updated, showing the Syndicate ships adjusting their formation into a classic encirclement pattern. Whatever they were planning, they clearly didn't intend to let the Stellar Wanderer escape intact. Options? Brakhon asked. Limited, Hemrix replied from the bridge through the comm system. They outgun us 8-1. They've got us surrounded, and our hyperdrive is still charging from the last jump. However, Edge said, with a tone that suggested he was about to make everyone's day significantly more interesting, we may have some resources they aren't aware of. Such as? Well, Current said, exchanging glances with the other Nexari. When we said we made minor modifications to your ship's systems. The lights dimmed, then brightened to a level that was somehow both more comfortable and more ominous. The air itself seemed to hum with energy that hadn't been there before, and every display screen in the cargo bay activated to show readouts that looked like they belonged on a ship 5 times the Stellar Wanderer's size. We may have been understating things, Whisper admitted. Significantly. Jamie looked around at the transformed cargo bay, then at the Cubs, who were no longer pretending to be anything other than the most competent intelligence operatives in known space. Just out of curiosity, he said, what exactly did you do to this ship? Edge's expression was the alien equivalent of a satisfied smile. We made it worthy of the beings it carries. Outside, 8 Syndicate ships closed in on what they assumed was a helpless research vessel with a small crew and some valuable refugees. They were about to discover that their assumptions were incomplete. The battle that followed would have been remembered as one of the most spectacular tactical engagements in recorded galactic history, if anyone outside the immediate participants had survived to record it. As it happened, the only witnesses were 8 very surprised Syndicate crews, 1 bemused Kethmoran research team, and 6 Nexari who had apparently spent their spare time turning a peaceful exploration vessel into something that made dreadnoughts nervous. Engaging defensive protocols, Edge announced with the casual tone of someone ordering coffee. The Stellar Wanderer suddenly sprouted weapons that definitely hadn't been in the original blueprints, while its shields flared to life with an intensity that made nearby space look like someone had set Aurora Borealis on fire. "Where did you get military-grade plasma cannons?" Bracon demanded, watching through the cargo bay's viewport as his supposedly defenseless ship began systematically dismantling vessels that should have outclassed it in every category. "Technically, we didn't get them," Current replied, manipulating controls that had materialized from panels that used to be decorative wall fixtures. "We made them. Your fabrication systems are quite impressive once you remove the safety limitations." "You removed the safety limitations on our fabrication systems?" "Only the ones that prevented creative interpretation of engineering specifications," Whisper said helpfully. "We left all the ones that prevent, catastrophic explosion." Jamie, who had been watching the tactical display with the expression of someone whose day had taken several turns he hadn't expected, suddenly straightened. "Wait, they're not trying to destroy the ship." "What do you mean?" Moltara asked. "Look at their targeting patterns. They're going for engines and life support, not weapons or hull integrity. They want us alive." "Which means," Edge said grimly, "they want us functional. All of us." The largest Syndicate vessel, a predatory thing that looked like someone had crossed a battleship with a nightmare, suddenly accelerated toward the Stellar Wanderer with the clear intention of ramming. But instead of impact, it deployed boarding clamps and began cutting through the hull with surgical precision. "They're boarding," Hemrix announced unnecessarily, since the sound of hull breach alarms was making that fact abundantly clear. "Excellent," Edge said with satisfaction. "This simplifies things considerably." "How does being boarded simplify anything?" Bracon asked. "Because now they're inside our ship," Harmony explained, "where we have advantages." What followed was less a battle and more a carefully orchestrated demonstration of why you should never corner intelligent beings who have had 3 days to prepare their environment. The Syndicate boarding parties found themselves facing not just armed resistance, but corridors that reconfigured themselves in real time, gravity that shifted without warning, and air that occasionally became mildly psychoactive in ways that made their weapons feel too heavy to lift. "Are you gassing them?" Jamie asked, watching through internal security feeds as Syndicate troops stumbled through passages that seemed to lead everywhere except where they intended to go. "Nothing harmful," Current assured him. "Just some atmospheric adjustments that encourage relaxation and poor decision-making. It's amazing what you can accomplish with minor modifications to life support systems." "You modified our life support systems too." "We modified everything," Edge said cheerfully. "Your ship is now considerably more sophisticated than its original designers intended. Consider it a thank-you gift." The boarding action concluded when the Syndicate forces found themselves somehow corralled into the ship's main cargo hold, where they discovered that the floor had become uncomfortably warm, and the air smelled strongly of flowers that made them want to take a nice, long nap within 20 minutes. The most feared raiders in this sector were sitting in neat rows, looking confused and asking if anyone had brought snacks. "Impressive," Bracon admitted. "But this still leaves us with the problem of what to do next." "Actually," Jamie said slowly, "I think it solves our problem entirely." "How?" Jamie gestured to the tactical display, where the remaining Syndicate ships were maintaining distance, while trying to figure out why their boarding action had resulted in their crews requesting meditation music and expressing sudden interest in sustainable agriculture. They came here expecting to capture helpless refugees and a cargo ship. Instead, They found something that neutralized their forces without firing a shot. Your point? My point is that we just demonstrated something the galaxy has never seen before. A perfect fusion of human intuition, Nexari intelligence, and Kethmaran technology. We didn't just defend ourselves, we won without actually hurting anyone. Edge tilted his head thoughtfully. The human raises an interesting perspective. The Syndicate operates on the assumption that superior force guarantees victory. But superior force is irrelevant when your opponents can predict your actions, modify your environment, and neutralize your advantages without engaging in direct conflict. You're talking about changing the fundamental nature of warfare, Moltara said. We're talking about making warfare obsolete, Current corrected. Why fight when you can simply make fighting inconvenient? Brakhon stared at the display, where Syndicate ships were beginning to withdraw with the kind of confused haste that suggested their command structure was having difficulty processing what had just happened. And you developed this capability in 3 days? We had excellent inspiration, Harmony said, looking directly at Jamie. Watching someone consistently choose care over control, trust over suspicion, and cooperation over dominance, it suggested new approaches to old problems. I didn't do anything special, Jamie protested. Exactly, Edge replied. You didn't try to be special. You simply responded to each situation with genuine concern for the well-being of others. No hidden agendas, no political calculations, no strategic considerations, just authentic care. And that's apparently so rare that it's revolutionary? Jamie asked. In 12,000 cycles of galactic civilization, Whisper said gently, yes. The silence that followed was broken by a communication from the lead Syndicate vessel. The screen flickered to life, revealing a being whose species Brakhon didn't recognize, but whose expression of baffled frustration was universal. Stellar Wanderer, the being said, we demand the return of our boarding parties. Of course, Edge replied politely. They'll be returned shortly. Though you should know they've expressed interest in starting a support group for reformed raiders. Apparently, the experience was quite therapeutic. The Syndicate commander's expression shifted through several emotions that the translator couldn't identify. What did you do to them? We gave them time to think, Jamie said simply. Turns out, when people aren't constantly being threatened or manipulated, they start asking interesting questions about their life choices. This is impossible. This is evolution, Edge corrected. The next step in how intelligent beings interact with each other. Care to join us, or would you prefer to keep doing things the old way? The communication ended abruptly. Within an hour, the Syndicate fleet had departed, taking their slightly bewildered crews and leaving behind a series of very polite apology messages. So, Brakhon said eventually, what happens now? Now, Edge replied, we begin the interesting part. We have a ship that can defend itself without violence, a crew that represents 3 different approaches to problem solving, and a human who has demonstrated that trust is possible between any beings willing to be genuinely honest with each other. And we have a galaxy full of conflicts that could be resolved by beings who understand that the greatest strength isn't the ability to destroy, but the wisdom to know when destruction is unnecessary. Jamie looked around the cargo bay, at the Nexari who had chosen to trust him, at the Kethmaran crew who had learned to trust them, and at the ship that had somehow become more than the sum of its parts. You're talking about starting a movement. We're talking about finishing one, Current corrected. The movement toward a civilization based on understanding rather than dominance. You started it the moment you chose to feed 6 scared refugees without asking what you'd get in return. That wasn't a choice, Jamie said. That was just what you do. Exactly, Edge replied with satisfaction. And once enough beings understand that, the galaxy becomes a very different place. Outside the viewport, the stars continued their ancient dance, but somehow they seemed brighter now, full of possibilities that hadn't existed before 6 small beings decided to trust a human smuggler with questionable hair and an apparently revolutionary approach to basic decency. The cubs, the Nexari, had stopped pretending to be anything other than who they were. The pack had learned that strength came in forms they'd never considered. And somewhere in the space between worlds, a new kind of family was learning that trust, once freely given and honestly earned, could change everything, even the universe's sense of humor. 6 months later, the Stellar Wanderer had become something that made diplomatic corps nervous, and military strategists wake up in cold sweats. Not because it was dangerous, quite the opposite. It had developed an alarming tendency to resolve conflicts by making everyone involved sit down, have a decent meal, and actually listen to each other. The ship's reputation had spread through unofficial channels. A vessel crewed by beings who could read intentions with perfect accuracy, commanded by officers who had learned that strength didn't require violence, and guided by a human who treated everyone he met like they mattered. Word was, if you brought your problems to the Wanderer, you left with solutions you never knew existed. Jamie had tried to protest that he was still just a smuggler with questionable life choices, but the Nexari had pointed out that job descriptions were less important than character, and his character had accidentally started a revolution in how intelligent beings treated each other. Revolution seems like a strong word, he'd said. What would you call it when basic decency becomes so rare that demonstrating it changes the course of galactic civilization? Edge had replied. The cubs still insisted on Jamie feeding them, though now it was clearly ceremonial, a daily reminder that trust, once earned, was worth maintaining. The pack had learned to read Nexari emotional cues, while the Nexari had mastered Kethmaran tactical thinking. Together, they'd created something entirely new, a crew that could solve problems by understanding them rather than overpowering them. The galaxy was slowly learning that there were alternatives to the old ways of doing things, that conflicts could end with understanding rather than victory, that the strongest ships were those crewed by beings who genuinely cared about each other's well-being. And it had all started because a scruffy human had looked at 6 scared refugees and decided they deserved to eat. Sometimes the universe's sense of humor was actually pretty good.